Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Chicago! It's good to be home. It is good to be home, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling fired up.
Sounds and sights from Chicago last night. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power, live from Chicago on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. Having heard from the former President Barack Obama, the former First Lady Michelle Obama, I think the room full of delegates still recovering from that night that we saw.
Yeah, of course, two of the most popular figures in Democratic politics, but that was not all. We also heard from the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, who spoke about his wife, Kamala Harris, even though she herself was not present in the convention hall last night, having gone with Tim Walz to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, filling the Pfizer Forum where the RNC was held last month with 18,000 people. And of course, it will be Tim Walz in his turn in the spotlight tonight. She
made a brief appearance on the video screen.
Yeah.
People are getting a little bit of Kamala Harris before the big speech. This one, of course, day 3, a fight for our freedoms.
Yes.
The theme, Kailey, if that matters to anyone. But of course, the headliner tonight is going to be her running mate, Tim Walz.
Yeah, we'll also hear from former President Bill Clinton, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. There is a very long list of speakers slotted for this evening. So let's get the latest now and a recap of last night with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who has eyes on the United Center here in Chicago. Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Kailey. Last night was actually the first time that we heard from former President Barack Obama since President Joe Biden decided to drop out of the 2024 race. His speech last night was largely seen as this transition moment here at the Democratic National Convention, from President Biden's speech on Monday night to now introducing voters to this new Democratic ticket. I want you to take a listen here to former President Obama last night on the convention floor, addressing everybody and signaling that this is a new era for the Democratic Party.
The torch has been passed. Now it is up to all of us to fight for the America we believe in, for all the incredible energy we've been able to generate over the last few weeks, for all the rallies and the memes. This will still be a tight race in a closely divided country.
Both the former president and former First Lady Michelle Obama, who also spoke, tried to emphasize the newfound energy Kamala Harris's groundbreaking candidacy as the first woman of color presidential nominee is bringing to voters. But as you heard, they also warned this is expected to be a very close race, using the moment to deliver pointed criticism of former President Donald Trump, too, as Harris tries to build this broad coalition of support in her relatively new campaign. This through line that we're watching is this desire to prevent a second Trump term, whether that's been from moderates, progressives, or even former Republicans that we've seen on stage at the Democratic National Convention. Now, Joe and Kailey, looking ahead to tonight, we know that now Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will officially accept his vice presidential nomination when he takes the stage and introduces himself to voters here tonight.
It's going to be a big night. Of course, Tyler will bring us inside the hall a little bit later on and see how things are shaping up on the floor of the convention on day 3. Tyler, Kendall, thank you so much, as always. Joining us now, Bloomberg Economics Stephanie Flanders, to talk about what, of course, is the overriding issue in this campaign, and one that we haven't necessarily heard enough about, Kailey, when it comes to details. Thanks for being with us. It's great to see you in Chicago.
Good to see you.
If that is true, if the economy is the number one issue in this campaign, are these candidates saying enough?
Well, I mean, certainly this week is not a week. The convention week is never a great one for policy wonks.
I guess that's true.
And I think this one probably more than usual, because there's so much focus on building up the vibes for Kamala Harris, and also sort of fleshing out her vision, firing up the troops, all the usual things. But I do think you saw even last week in her speech in North Carolina, she's trying to do that slightly difficult pivot from the Biden-Harris ticket, where the perception was they were too often telling voters they ought to feel better about the economy than they actually were. There was a bit of that in her speech, but I think she was also trying to feel the pain of people who feel that their energy bills and their food bills are still too high, and proposed some concrete things. I think what she talked about, she has focused on housing. That is a big issue for people. She has seem reasonably credible proposals on that. I think more populist, certainly less popular with economists. Yeah. Her talk of price gouging, having price controls on for groceries and other things, and following Donald Trump in this rather odd policy of exempting tips from tax. So I think we've seen hints of a pivot away, a focus on the unfinished business of the Biden administration economically, but as you say, a lot more to do, because that's one of the issues people were not really feeling it on.
Yeah. Well, and you key in on housing specifically. That's actually something that former President Obama addressed in his remarks last night. Here's a taste.
If we want to make it easier for more young people to buy a home, we need to build more units and clear away some of the outdated laws and regulations that made it harder to build homes for working people in this country. That is a priority, and she's put out a bold new plan to do just that.
But part of the plan she's put out, obviously, including the down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers, has been criticized, to your point, about potentially being something that could be deficit additive and therefore potentially cause more economic problems realistically than it solves. We've seen criticism in that regard, frankly, for both of these campaigns. Donald Trump for tax cuts that also could be added to the deficit, inflationary policy pursuits broadly. Is there a real difference in the outcome for the economy, no matter who wins, even if they get about it a different way?
I mean, one difference is there is a commitment. So far, Kamala Harris has signed up to the sort of Biden budget proposals for next year. Not that they ever mean very much, but there is a plan which involves the corporate tax increase, which supposedly is offsetting some of the spending increases. Doesn't offset these new spending proposals that she put forward last week. But I think most economists would say that the least sustainable path that we're seeing from the two candidates would be Donald Trump's, because he wants to make permanent that enormous tax cut in the past few years and has said nothing really concrete about spending reductions. But on the housing side, I think the key thing, there's always a challenge, right? It's for a chunk of a huge chunk of the voters, it's their main source of wealth. But for another big chunk, it's their main expense, the main thing they struggle with. And how do you bring down the cost without also feeling like you're hitting people's wealth? So that's why I think that two-sided approach she has actually does make some sense, a real focus on increasing the supply, the baby build, along with the sort of pushing to home.
Have they heard that? You need to send that to them. That's good material.
I don't think that's
Let me just ask you the same question slightly differently. Are we sitting here in Chicago making too much of a deal and too much of an assumption that the next president of the United States can actually have enough influence against the forces of the marketplace to control inflation?
Well, I think there's certainly
one person.
There's one concrete thing which a president can do to contribute to inflation, and that is impose a tariff on all imported goods.
So the prospect of making it worse is more likely than making it better.
But I think you make a good point that it is very much down to the Federal Reserve, and there have been some question marks about whether a Trump 2.0 would respect the independence of Jay Powell and the Federal Reserve, and that's something we're definitely watching.
Yeah, of course, as this convention week coincides with Jackson Hole, and we're all waiting to hear from Jerome Powell on Friday. Bloomberg Stephanie Flanders, thank you so much for joining us. Now, while the markets await Chairman Powell and are paying close attention to every word spoken out of Jackson Hole, here in Chicago, everyone was captivated last night by every word spoken by the former president, Barack Obama. Here's some more of what he said.
We believe that true freedom gives each of us the right to make decisions about our own life, how we worship, what our family looks like, how many kids we have, who we marry. And we believe that freedom requires us to recognize that other people have the freedom to make choices that are different than ours. That's okay. If a parent or grandparent occasionally says something that makes us cringe, we don't automatically assume they're bad people. We recognize that the world is moving fast, that they need time and maybe a little encouragement to catch up. Our fellow citizens deserve the same grace we hope they'll extend to us. The ties that bind us together are still there. We still coach Little League and look out for our elderly neighbors. We still feed the hungry in churches and mosques and synagogues and temples. We share the same pride when our Olympic athletes compete for the gold. Because the vast majority of us do not want to live in a country that's bitter and divided. We want something better.
Joining us now for more on what we heard last night and what we have yet to hear on this night, night 3, and of course, ultimately night 4 of the Democratic National Convention here in Chicago is Brad Howard. He is Corcoran Street Group founder and a Democratic strategist here with us on set. Always good to see you here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Brad. We heard from both of the Obamas yesterday what felt like a message, and not a veiled one, about the risk of complacency. This idea that this very much is still going to be a fight despite all of the enthusiasm about Harris's candidacy. How does the party turn the enthusiasm that's being felt here in Chicago into actual votes
I think
November?
The beauty of the Obama coalition was always that you may not agree with me 100% of the time on all of the issues, but there's a lot at stake, and you've got to vote. And I think they're carrying that message through now to this newer generation who may not agree with 100% of everything that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz take a position on, but that doesn't mean you should stay at home. It doesn't mean you should sit on the couch. It means that you've got to look at the alternatives that are presented to you and which vision is more like the vision you want for the future of America. And I think they are so good at making that case to young voters in particular and voters of color who often feel disenfranchised by our politics. I think you are seeing a beautiful consolidation of the base of those two entities. You know, we've got protests here at the Chicago, but even last night, you've seen folks, Doug, reaching out to them and people mentioning the protests. Like, we welcome this dissenting voice within the Democratic Party because we are a Big Ten party. Take that energy, though, and put it into victory in November, because what's at stake is if you really care about the Palestinian people, Donald Trump is going to do no good. And so, you've got to really get on board here and come and unite and defeat Donald Trump in November.
Well, there was a bit of nostalgia in the room last night.
Oh, yeah,
as
man.
Democrats remembered what it was like to live.
What it was like to really hear a speech.
I think a lot of memories came back for some folks. It was not just Barack Obama. It was former First Lady Michelle Obama, who also spoke to the delegates. Let's listen.
A familiar feeling that's been buried too deep for far too long. You know what I'm talking about. It's the contagious power of hope.
Indeed, talking about being on the cusp of a brighter day. There were some reportedly in the Biden camp bristled a little bit, thinking that she was maybe lumping the Biden administration into the Trump and just kind of 8 years of whatever that was, not noting the continuation of hope maybe that Joe Biden brought. It's pretty hard to project this new feeling of optimism without making a commentary on what's just passed.
Well, I think look, we are extremely grateful for Joe Biden for what he did in 2020 in defeating Donald Trump and bringing us out of one of the worst economic conditions this country had ever faced in a global pandemic. But at the same time, too, putting a period to Joe Biden's incredible legacy also feels like we're closing the chapter on Donald Trump, right? We're trying to do the same thing here. And so I think what she's saying is there are a lot of people that still feel like we haven't fully emerged from the pandemic, that there's still elements of that toxic politics, the conspiracy-driven agenda, that all the folks are still trying to blame various people on the pandemic when voters want to look to the future. And I think the case they're making last night is we are moving past this point. We are putting a period on that effort and those times, and we are looking to a bright new future. Donald Trump's going to send you back into that chaos of the past. We are now offering you an alternative, fresh, new vision for the future that's full of hope and unity, and not the divisive politics of one individual who's got a litany of cases he wants to bring in terms of retaliatory measures.
Well, as we think about the attacks that Donald Trump has now lobbed at this new ticket of Harris and Walz, in part, especially when Walz was selected, it was a criticism that he is ultra-liberal, dangerously so, is their characterization, that he is incredibly progressive. How do you think, with that criticism in mind, he's going to present himself to America tonight? Is he going to try to bring back some of his progressive policies as governor of Minnesota, or focus on his career as a legislator, where he was more in the middle?
I think he's going to do both, because no matter even though his positions may have changed a little bit over time, his values have not. And Tim Walz is a pro-family Democrat. He was a pro-family member of Congress. He was a pro-family governor. He is going to be a pro-family vice president. And this is going to be one of the most pro-family tickets in the history of modern American politics. And so I think what you're going to see is just telling voters who he is. And I think once you understand Tim Walz, you understand his values. And his values are what's going to guide him in his vice presidencies. He helps to enact Kamala Harris's vision. And these two together represent two, I think, very, uniquely American upbringings and pieces of society at the moment. A Midwestern dad who, really tried very hard to have a family, got his family, coached football, just what you would expect, flannel-wearing Midwestern dad, and a woman of color who clawed her way through adversity to come up and grew up in a place like California. These are two very different stories that coming together, showing Americans that you can be very different backgrounds and yet work together. And that's something we're going to see.
You mentioned the protesters, Brad. We haven't seen what many folks predicted. Tens of thousands facing off with police. There was a bit of a skirmish last evening outside the city's Israeli consulate. We saw about a dozen protesters detained. Is that what you expected? How come this isn't coming to fruition?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think number one, Joe Biden's the one making the decisions. I think had he been the nominee, you probably would have had more of a pressure campaign to do so. Yeah. I think so, yeah. I think Kamala has shown an ability to tell these protesters that she's wants to hear from them, but also this is her time. Let her tell her story. We will have times to have these conversations. And I think Democrats are all united behind peace in the Middle East and about bringing the hostages home. Yeah. There's differences on how we do that, and those will be played out. But also, too, Chicago PD, you got to give them credit. They know how to handle large crowds. They know how to handle protesters. They've done a wonderful job. There have been a few skirmishes and things that we could have done a little differently. But all in all, I think the protesters are feeling heard and acknowledged by the convention speakers, and I think that is critical, too.
And finally, we only have a minute left, Brad, but it's been a pretty stacked first 3 nights. Yeah. It will be another stacked 3 nights. People that you would think maybe would introduce Kamala Harris have already spoken or are going to speak this evening. Who is worthy of introducing the nominee on Thursday?
Give us some news.
Yeah, well, we're going to see. But, I'm excited tonight to hear from Bill Clinton. I'm from Arkansas, Arkansas boy. Bill Clinton is the best messenger Democrats have on the economy. I think you're going to see him talk about that tonight. I'm super excited to have him put into stark contrast because right now, I think the polling is showing that Trump has a slight lead on the economy, though Kamala's overtaking him. She's rolled out her economic plan last week. I think you're going to see a really strong pitch on the economy, and we're going to steal that away from the Republicans and win in November on it.
Great to see you in Chicago.
Thank you.
Meet you back home in D.C. Brad Howard, Corcoran Street Group, Democratic strategist, setting us up here for night 3. We thank you as always. I thought he was going to say Beyonce. There's no.
Yeah, I'm trying to get the Beyonce news. And Taylor Swift. I want to break that for you here on Bloomberg.
Straight ahead, San Francisco Mayor London Breed.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It is day 3, turning into night 3. This is the evening when we will hear from the vice presidential nominee, Governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, as he makes his formal acceptance of the nomination. We'll be hearing from a number of other high-profile speakers, including another former president, Bill Clinton, tonight after we heard from former President Barack Obama last night, Jeff.
They'll be upping the ante here as each night goes by, although I think for a lot of the delegates in the room, it's going to be tough to beat the Obama speeches, the First Lady and the former president last evening. But you know who else we're going to hear from tonight is Nancy Pelosi, who played a pretty major role in the development of this campaign over the last several weeks, and her message is going to be pretty important for that room, too.
Yeah, especially whether or not she perhaps talks about the incumbent president, Joe Biden, given the behind-the-scenes role we understood she played in the actual pushing him out of his re-election campaign. She, of course, one of the still most powerful figures in Democratic politics.
As we seize upon the voice of San Francisco, not just Nancy Pelosi, but the mayor of San Francisco, London Breed, is in Chicago, part of this convention and with us right now at the table. Mayor, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
You have known Kamala Harris for a long time. You've been friends for 20 years outside of politics. You know this candidate, this nominee, better than most people who we're going to talk with this week. And I understand that she's had wonderful advice for you over the years. I wonder what your advice is for her at this convention on Thursday night.
Wow. Me give Kamala Harris advice? I'm not used to that one.
As only a friend could.
Yeah, but the one thing I would say, when she is herself and giving it her all and speaking from the heart, there is nothing like it. She is strong, she is firm, she is committed to doing this work, but also she's a very compassionate person who deeply cares about justice and taking care of people. And she's proven that time and time again with the work that she's done over the years.
Well, certainly she's leaned into her past experience as a prosecutor. Of course, she was the DA of San Francisco before she became Attorney General of the state of California. And we've heard different iterations on the stage last night of this election being something of a prosecutor up against a felon. How hard do you expect her to lean into that image, knowing that for some segments of the Democratic coalition especially, it may actually be a bit problematic?
Well, I think it's important for her to talk about the work that she did. So not only did she prosecute people in San Francisco when we were dealing with the height of gun violence, I mean, she prosecuted people who committed murder. And it's important to make it clear that she was basically not holding any bars and doing that work. But at the same time, people who were in jail for small offenses, her Back on Track program provided a second chance at life as long as people were willing to put in the work to get through the program. So I think that you could support both. She wrote a book about it. She said it's not about being tough on crime. It's not about being soft on crime, but it's about being smart on crime and making sure that there's fairness, there's justice, and there's balance.
Well, to stick with that theme for a moment, you have something in common with this city of Chicago in that you are held up, San Francisco, Chicago, by Republicans on a regular basis as an example of what is wrong with progressive politics when it comes to crime. I know that you've tried to make strides in San Francisco, and how do you message that to people when you're hearing so much from the other side?
Well, we have made strides. And in fact, San Francisco has one of the lowest crime rates of any major city in the country. This is the lowest crime rate we've had in over a decade. And not to mention, we are on track to have even one of the lowest homicide rates we've had in the history of our city. So when you fact check and you look at the data and look at actually what's happening in San Francisco, people will be surprised. When I talk to other mayors, they're like, I wish I had those kind of small, big city problems. And the data doesn't lie. And I think if people look deep into what is going on in San Francisco, they'll see that it is one of the safest cities in the country.
Of course, it's not just about crime, though. It's about the wider issue of homelessness, too. You yourself have called for tough love when it comes to the notion of clearing out tent encampments, for example. Is that tough love working? What about progress on that front?
Yeah, it's been challenging, but since I've been in office, we've helped over 15,000 people exit homelessness. We've never even had a point in time account with, more than like 8,000 or so people. So it's been really a tough struggle, but we also have to make sure when people are rejecting what we're offering in terms of services, we are now no longer just leaving them out on the streets, and we're being a lot more aggressive. To a certain extent, it's working because more people are accepting help, but there is still a really tough group of people, mostly tragically because of drug use, that's having an impact. We're still struggling with that point, but we're still making progress. The streets look better, it looks cleaner. We have one neighborhood that continues to experience more challenges than others. But when you come to San Francisco and you drive around our city and you look around our city, people are always like, what is everyone talking about? So you got to come see it for yourself and then check the facts in terms of the data as to what really is happening in San Francisco.
Well, if we can hold on to the issue of housing more broadly here, this is a big deal for this campaign and for this economy right now. And I know for a fact that that's not new for you. You've actually made this a major issue for you as a city official, as a commissioner, as mayor. Taking different ideas, experimental ideas, to see what can be done to create more housing. I know that there's an effort to get people to a point where they can afford a first-time home, but you need something to move into. You've suggested a lot of different ideas and tried them out, like converting empty public housing, for instance, city housing, city buildings, rather. What advice do you have for the campaign that could be a national model to create more housing in this country?
Well, Kamala Harris said it on the stage to say getting rid of the red tape that makes it difficult to produce housing. And fortunately in California, that just happened with a bill that was passed by the state legislature led by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco. And that bill will allow housing to be as of right. If the zoning already allows for you to do 4, 6, 8 stories. Why is there so many obstacles that are able to get in the way? And now that won't happen as long as you're following what the existing laws are.
Like parking requirements, for instance?
Yes,
You got to that in San Francisco.
Definitely. We could have those or not have those. We're making our city more of a transit-first city, as well as protected bike lanes, allowing different modes of transportations to thrive in our city. So it's all of the above. And bureaucratic red tape is at the heart of the challenges that exist. And I love the fact that our vice president, soon to be president, put that at the forefront of the conversation, and California is already leading the way.
Well, certainly she has to, at the forefront of the conversation, have these notions of the economy, knowing it ranks so highly consistently in polls as the top issue for voters. Another issue that ranks highly, though, is the border and migration. You hear frequently in the Republican camp that every state, every city is now effectively a border city. How do you view that issue when it comes not just to the city of San Francisco, but the state of California as a whole, and what the appropriate, if we're going with a tough love kind of message here, way is to deal with migration at the border?
Well, it's important for them to implement the plan that they're talking about to make sure that there's a significant level of accountability. But I also want to be very clear, because it's not just one thing. It's not just about people. It's also about substances. And in fact, the National Guard, the Drug Enforcement Agency, the U.S. Attorney's Office, who's working with us locally, and including our state representatives, the California Highway Patrol, the National Guard, they are all collaborating on using technology in a way that is, making arrest at the border for the illegal fentanyl that continues to come into cities like San Francisco. And so that aggressive effort using technology can help us address those issues, in addition to the challenges with people who are coming over the border. I believe that Kamala Harris is the right person to implement a really tough strategy, but also a compassionate and understanding one, especially because it is so complicated in that we are a country built on immigrants. And so we have to make sure that we're balancing that as well.
You say that she's the right person, and yet, and I'm sure you've heard this frequently in the last several weeks, Republicans argue she was put in charge of the border issue, maybe not given the actual border czar title, but this was an issue she was supposed to own as vice president. She has been vice president for over 3.5 years. If she couldn't get control of it then, how are we supposed to believe she could get control of it when she's actually sitting in the Oval Office herself? Well,
here's the thing. Control means different things. And I go back to my experience of the control around illegal substances that are making it across the border. The number of arrests, the number of drugs that have been confiscated as a result of the efforts of the White House, of the federal partners that I mentioned earlier, has yielded significant results. And I believe that that component of what they're doing even now has been impactful and will continue to be more impactful. In terms of some of the other challenges, they have to continue to make sure that there's, a push. I mean, everyone's talking about a wall of this and a wall of that. A wall is not going to, continuously keep people out. The goal is to try and get a better control over the border and making sure that we're implementing the right policies and being fair and equitable in our strategies, and developing better relationships with the countries, in order to help support them so that we don't experience this challenge of everyone trying to, flee from a particular location to get into the United States. That's a big part of it as well.
What would happen to California's workforce and economy if Donald Trump did become the next president and shut down the border, as he says? If you had no immigration in the workforce, could your economy sustain itself?
Well, I don't believe so. I think immigration is an important part of, how our society works. And we need to make sure that we're balancing that with the needs of the people that we're here to serve. And ultimately, we're seeing some incredible opportunities within the job markets all over the state of California. And our goal is to do everything we can to balance that. But going back to some of the illegal activities around the drugs. That is the thing that is harming our economy the most, and that is the thing that is important to focus on as we continue to move in this direction.
Well, if you listen to Donald Trump, he has said repeatedly that he actually thinks the economic problem with migration, in part, is that migrants are coming to this country and they're taking black jobs. He said this on multiple occasions, and it was certainly noted by the former First Lady, Michelle Obama, last night.
Who's going to tell him that the job he's currently seeking might just be one of those black jobs?
One of those moments I think we've all seen on social media a lot in the last 12 hours, certainly. But she, of course, was on that stage speaking as a Black woman, and a powerful one at that, someone who was the First Lady of the United States, speaking on behalf of another woman of color who is now the Democratic nominee and will be formally accepting it on Thursday. You yourself are a woman of color as well. And I wonder, as we consider the historic nature of this candidacy, how the appropriate way to talk about that is, especially in the face of language like we're hearing from Donald Trump. Do you address it head on or do you ignore it?
Well, I think you address it head on, and I think it has been addressed. For example, implying somehow that Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable when you look at her qualifications of her, just look at her resume in comparison to his. There is no comparison. She wasn't born into privilege. She worked really hard to get a law degree on her own, to really fight for a number of positions that she ran for, and to push for the kinds of policies that have helped to support Americans and the rights of women, LGBTQ community, and so on and so forth. I can go on, but that's one of the challenges that sometimes, women and women of color have is, well, how did you get there? It must have been someone else. And, to be very clear, when the man goes through a same process, that doesn't get questioned. And I think that's kind of the frustrating part of this, which is why I love being a part of the Democratic Party, because you see people who are elevating women. You see many men who spoke last night at the DNC, highlighting Kamala Harris in such an extraordinary way. And I'm really proud. And it's no comparison. I think it's important for us to remind the American people, not just of her qualifications, but why is this a race in the first place in light of what Donald Trump has done to really, create a huge barrier in this country overall, with his policies, with his pushes, with his lies, with his disrespect and his divisiveness. There should not be a question, but we are going to continue to elevate Kamala Harris and do everything we can to ensure that she gets elected the next president of the United States.
Just lastly, we hear from Donald Trump and Republicans that Kamala Harris, you're the mayor of San Francisco, is just another San Francisco liberal. How do you respond to that?
Well, I would respond, the Republicans continue to point to San Francisco, but at the end of the day, oftentimes they are picking up their iPhone, which was introduced in San Francisco, calling their Ubers or Lyft, companies started and based in San Francisco, to go to their Airbnb company still and started in San Francisco, and then to go and tweet something nasty about our city, which again was a company until recently in San Francisco. $34 billion of venture capitalist investment last year alone, the AI capital of the world. That's what I will say. You can continue to try and put out a narrative, but the facts tell a different story. And we point to the facts and the economy and everything that San Francisco stands for on the world stage. Everything that everyone is using as far as technology, it starts right in San Francisco. And again, we're looking forward to making sure Kamala Harris gets elected, because then San Francisco will be on a whole nother national stage.
All right, San Francisco Mayor London Breed, great to have you here with us in Chicago.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
And of course, for someone like Kamala or anyone to be elected, you have to win the Electoral College. You got to get those 270 Electoral College votes. And the map, as we understand it, includes, Joe, about 7 swing states. But there have been conversations, at least when Biden was still in the race, as to whether or not a state like Virginia could be up for grabs for a Republican. And even still, there does seem to be a suggestion that maybe even a state like Florida could be one up for grab for the Democrats.
Depends who you ask.
Yeah.
Like our next guest.
Indeed. And on that note, we go now to a congresswoman from Florida. Democrat Debbie Wasserman Schultz is here with us on set in Chicago. Great to see you.
Great to see you both.
Congresswoman, if we could just begin, knowing that you just had a decisive victory in your primary in Florida last night as well. What are you seeing on the ground in Florida? Do you think it would be wise for the Harris campaign to be investing resources in the state, knowing the many, many media markets it has? It's a very expensive state to be competitive in. But if she made the decision to, could she actually be competitive?
I'm telling everybody, as are most political folks in Florida, don't sleep on our state. We have some metrics that are emerging. Remember, for most election cycles in this century, we have been a purple state. We've been hyper competitive. Barack Obama won Florida both times that he ran. And I'll give you an example from just yesterday's primary. The enthusiasm among Democratic voters is off the charts. I mean, just to give you an idea, I won my primary, but it's not the win. It's the difference in the voter turnout between Democrats and Republicans. 34,000 people voted in, I got 34,000 votes. The primary winner on the Republican side got 13,000 votes. So just in terms of enthusiasm, you can see the difference. But polling last week, both national polls that came out that polled Florida had the race within 3 and 5. And then if you look at the volunteer organization on the ground, 22,000 people signed up to volunteer to elect Kamala Harris President of the United States. So with the resources, and also the Republicans have continued to distort their advantage. They say they have 1 million more registered voters in Florida. They don't. What they did was that they suppressed the voters who haven't voted in 2 elections and now show them as inactive, even though they're still registered. So there aren't 1 million more Republicans registered to vote. We have huge enthusiasm. We beat almost every Moms for Liberty candidate that Ron DeSantis endorsed for school board races last night, about almost 24 that he endorsed, and he only won 6 of them. So the momentum is in our direction. No one should sleep on Florida.
Well, interesting. And looking more broadly, Florida and across the country, and not just the swing states, Congresswoman, our listeners and viewers should be reminded that you were chair of the DNC during Barack Obama's second convention.
Yes.
As president of the United States. Will you seek to duplicate his map?
Well, what we're seeking to do is make sure that we can capitalize on the enthusiasm and the contrast between the momentum that we have under Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because hope and optimism, like we had during the Obama years, and joy is what is pushing people forward, because they want a president who is going to fight for them to reduce prescription drug prices.
But you are talking about more states than you were when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket.
There is no question right now that we have different math in multiple different directions than we had just five or 6 weeks ago. And so what we can't do is just, move forward without pivoting and making the kind of adjustments that we need to and being nimble. And that's what our campaign operations are doing right now. And they're doing some recalculations so they can be ready for any opportunity.
Well, and I wonder how those recalculations are factoring into the likelihood of not just getting the majority in the House, but how large you think your majority could potentially be with Harris at the top of the ticket. You obviously are a member of House leadership. Has the goalposts moved? Initially, it was like, you just got to get those 4 seats. But what's the target now?
Well, we have to net 4 seats, and we have a very clear advantage in the fundraising. We have consistently outraised the NRCC, the Republican campaign finance operation, every single quarter of this election cycle. But it's not just that. Our incumbent frontline marginal members, they've outraised their opposition. Our red to blue candidates, they have a recruitment problem. They've got right-wing extremists all over the map. So the contrast is clear all the way down the ticket, from the White House pair of candidates down to legislative races. And voters are going to come out to the polls, elect our candidates, because they want someone who's thinking about moving forward, not a MAGA extremist Republican who's buried in the past, who's morose and brooding and unhappy. We've got to make sure that we have a positive, forward-thinking government so that we can ensure that this booming economy, 15 million plus jobs, making sure that we continue to bring prescription drug prices down, that we make sure that we have a plan like Kamala Harris does to make homeownership affordable and child tax credit reinstated. So many things that are important on the kitchen table, not a president like Donald Trump was, who cared only about making sure that the wealthy and the profitable businesses are able to do even better.
I want to ask you about an issue I know is very important to you and a lot of progressive Democrats, and that's our policy in Israel right now. It's the reason why we've been talking about protesters that in some cases have not materialized here in Chicago. Congresswoman, there are reports today that U.S. and Israeli officials think that this proposal for a bridge ceasefire deal is on the verge of collapsing. We heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Doha. Here's what he said.
Our message is simple, it's clear, and it's urgent. We need to get the ceasefire and hostage agreement over the finish line, and we need to do it now. Time is of the essence.
How important will it be for a ceasefire to be struck to find unity among progressives in the Democratic Party?
What's important is that Hamas release the hostages. What's important is that Israel not be expected, like any other nation shouldn't be expected, to live with a terrorist threat sworn on their destruction and the killing of all Jews on their doorstep. What's important is making sure that the terror threat that Palestinians in Gaza live with is ended, so that they can free Gaza from Hamas. And that, when we reach a ceasefire deal that releases those hostages, that ensures that we can have governance in Gaza that is peaceful and non-threatening, that is absolutely essential. The time that's running out is that we have 109 hostages still there, at least 8 that are American, that need to be freed. I mean, we have to make sure, and thanks to the Biden-Harris administration for staying at the table, pushing the negotiations forward, but Hamas needs to take this deal. That is the bottom line.
Well, and we'll wait to see if they do so and on what time frame, knowing that they also could be considering that it will be a different government come January if they drag this out long enough. You just mentioned what the Biden-Harris administration has done. Do you expect that there would be a serious departure from this administration's policy if it were instead a Harris-Walz administration? How does she differ from the incumbent president?
She doesn't differ. She's made very clear that she is right alongside President Biden. She's been a part of those discussions, the negotiations. Kamala Harris supports making sure that we have a ceasefire deal that brings the hostages home, that ends the terrorist threat on Israel's doorstep, that ensures that we can get humanitarian assistance and relief to the Palestinians who are victimized by Hamas themselves, and also continuing the strong U.S. aid to Israel. She said very clearly she's not for an arms embargo. We have the strongest plank in the Democratic Party platform, strongest pro-Israel plank of any party in decades. And the Republicans come nowhere near the commitments and the specificity in the Democratic Party platform that we have. And that's because the Democratic Party is the one that has solidly and consistently stood with Israel, not just in words, but in actions.
What happens to Gaza if Donald Trump is elected?
When it comes to how foreign policy is dealt with in general, I'm very fearful about what happens, because Donald Trump doesn't actually care about how to make sure that Gaza is governed in the aftermath and how you end the terrorist threat and ensure that the security apparatus that needs to be in place for Israel is put in place in a way that allows a peaceful transition and the negotiation over an Arab-forward governing coalition. He reacts only emotionally and not with thought or commitment. And I'm very fearful, because of Project 2025, of who he's going to put in place in these important State Department positions to ensure that we have real professionals who are able to do things like Joe Biden has, getting these negotiations together and making sure that we have a diplomatic apparatus that has the experience and the commitment they need.
Thanks for coming to see us.
Thank you so much.
Good luck the rest of this convention.
Thanks,
Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida, former chair of the DNC. We're live in Chicago on Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
We'll see, Joe, if things run a little bit more on schedule this evening, as twice in a row, the headliners, first President Biden, then former President Barack Obama, ran a little past prime time.
That's true.
On the East Coast.
We have the benefit, at least, of being an hour earlier here. It was past 11 p.m. when Barack Obama finally got on the stage, remembering Joe Biden's midnight appointment on Monday. It's going to be more important, I think, for convention organizers to make sure the running mate gets on a friendlier hour.
Yeah, because this is the first time for many in the country that they will be hearing directly from Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. She wasn't necessarily a well-known figure in Democratic politics until Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, and he coined the phrase weird in describing Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Here we are tonight. I think we'll hear that word. With us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist alongside Jeanne Zaino, Iona University, political science professor, senior fellow, democracy with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to see you both. Axios reporting that Tim Walz has never used a teleprompter before. Rick, the stakes here, and not just the speech itself, but the logistics around it. How do you prepare a candidate for a moment like that?
Well, certainly in this case, if he's never used a teleprompter, you get him a lot of work on a teleprompter because, of course, using a teleprompter at press conference is one thing. Using it in front of 50,000 people and in a big night like this, they're tricky to use. And so I think getting him comfortable with that, and comfort matters, is probably one of their number one situations. Two, getting him comfortable with the speech. Remember, these people haven't been the nominees very long. I mean, he just emerged 10 days ago. And so the reality for him is he's had to get comfortable quickly with probably the most important speech he'll ever give in his entire life. And so at this stage, he's probably sequestered with his age, running through the speech over and over and again, doing some tweaking. But now it's also controlling your nerves because this is a nervous moment when you walk out and that crowd goes crazy. And you can get really emotional if you don't have control of your senses.
Amazing.
Yeah, a bit higher stakes than, a locker room pep talk for the team or something like that for Coach Walz, Jeanne, as we've often heard him described. But on that note, they have leaned into this image of he was a football coach and a teacher. He's America's dad. He's a, everyday guy. Don't people also need to see on that stage, though, someone who could assume the office of the presidency if something were to happen to Kamala Harris? Is there such a thing as too much of the nice guy thing?
Never too much nice guy. No, I do think because most Americans, to your point, 3 weeks ago, outside of his own home state, had never heard of him, didn't know who he was. So he is going to have to introduce himself. My one concern about the timing is, don't we know that Bill Clinton has a part of this tonight? Yes. And who goes longer than Bill Clinton?
In conclusion,
going to have to pull him in. If he hasn't used the teleprompter and spoken at a convention, gosh, my advice would be, speed it up, folks. I say this in deference to my students. They think we all talk very slow because they listen to everything on top speed except for you guys. And so speed up the speech and ride the applause. You're speaking to people at home, not people in the room. So that is, he didn't ask for my advice. That would be my advice. I do think we're going to hear a lot about the coach. I do think we're going to hear a lot about his partner, Kamala Harris. I think we're going to hear less about policy. But I do think he has to make the case to the American people. God forbid something happens to Kamala Harris if they're elected. He is ready to assume that office. So, people keep telling me Kyle Chandler. I don't know who's going to introduce him, but that is the coach from Friday Night Lights. That's who he's going after, Kailey. So
you're just mapping all this out.
Listen, I got a lot of time here in Chicago, Joe.
Well, okay. Is he going to address the elephant in the room here, the questions of stolen valor and his military experience, or does he just fly over it?
He might fly high, right, as you say. He has something to say about that. Obviously, he's proud of his service career, and he's made it clear he doesn't think that should be part of a campaign. And he's actually complimented J.D. Vance's career in the military. So I would actually think that he would use that device of making the point that we honor everybody's service, no matter how or why they do it. And so that's a great shout out to every veteran in America. And that's how the line of attack should be. It should not be me versus you. It should be we're all in this together.
Well, we've heard not a lot of attack lines from Democrats here in Chicago, more so just lines of praise for both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, including from the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Vilsack. Tom Vilsack joined Bloomberg earlier today in his personal capacity, but he had this to say about Governor Walz.
Governor Walz is someone that you could put into any room in any community in any part of the country, and he would be able to relate to the people in that room, which means that he can be a very powerful spokesperson for rural America, for the small towns and rural places in the country that oftentimes don't get the level of attention that they deserve. He understands that. I think that's why he's been successful.
So on this idea of rural America, as we consider the kinds of populations and demographics they're trying to draw out and make sure vote for them in November, what is the message that rural America needs to hear, not just from Tim Walz, but from Kamala Harris herself?
You know, I think they need to hear that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz understand the challenges that they are facing. And I couldn't agree more with Tom Vilsack. As important as I thought last night was, and as good of a job as the DNC had a good night. The one criticism I had was the voters they need are these folks that he is talking about. And they are going to have to appeal to them with this message that Kamala Harris, we've heard her use, which is economic opportunity, sort of borrowing from an old style GOP where we are going to have opportunity for freedom, liberty, and success if you take it. So I think understanding their challenges and letting them know that they and their children and their grandchildren have a bright future ahead of them. And this is how, we won't get into the specifics, but those are the kind of messages that they're going to need to hear. And quite frankly, that's a danger the DNC runs here, is that if they are appealing to other folks on the coasts and not these people in the middle.
Well, so it's a battle for rural between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. How does Tim Walz win that argument without becoming too folksy and too cute in an address?
No, I don't think he does win that argument.
Yeah?
I mean, I think there's been a realignment. You know, Donald Trump won 256 counties that Barack Obama won twice, and Joe Biden in 2020 only won a dozen of those back. Those are gone. Those are Republicans now. They're going to vote Republican. It's a much better use of the Democrats' time, if you boil it down, to run up the numbers in suburbs and urban areas to offset the losses they're going to take in those counties. Look, they're not talking about the economy. That's what these people care about. They haven't benefited from the increased economy in the Biden administration, and they say so loudly in every focus group and every poll that we take. Donald Trump continues to outpace both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris when it comes to who's best able to manage the economy. So I think they've got to go where they can find votes, and it's not going to be in the rural communities.
Just on the idea that those people are now Republicans, are they Republicans or are they populists? Because isn't that the common thread that you could pull between those who would vote for Obama in 2008 and 2012 and who shifted to vote for Donald Trump?
Well, there's a third group, and I'd call them MAGAs.
Okay, sure.
And so that's some combination of those two things, right? And yet they're signed up. I mean, that's what you saw on the floor of the convention in Milwaukee for Donald Trump. These are the people who fuel the MAGA. And everyone said, oh, where are the votes coming from? Well, former Democrats, you know, who used to be working class whites in rural areas without college education are now the base of the Republican Party.
And this is why we saw the roll call that we saw last night, right? If you're trying to get young people in the suburbs and in urban areas, you put a show like that together. We would not have seen that in Milwaukee.
We would not have. And, you know, it was like the Super Bowl of politics. I heard from so many people again who said, we don't watch this stuff, but that was fun. And so, but I do agree with Rick that, you know, they may have lost those rural areas already, but they can't bleed them anymore. When you're talking about states like Wisconsin and Michigan, and they're going to be so tight. And that was one thing we heard from Michelle Obama yesterday. They've got to fight for those and watch for this notion of economic opportunity, economy from Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because that is the message they are trying to send. It's not going to be a winning message in those areas necessarily, but they want to stop bleeding there as they have been. Democrats have been for some time now.
Well, as we allude to this roll call, we should actually give our listeners and viewers a taste of what it was like in the United Center last night.
The proud great state of Alabama proudly cast 56 votes for the first Black woman president of the United States of America.
Colorado proudly casts its votes for Kamala Harris. Get it out! Indiana delivers its 86 delegates.
Minnesota, we cast 10 votes present, and we deliver 81 votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz.
California, we proudly cast our 482 votes for the next president, Kamala Harris. Yeah! Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight to officially nominate Kamala Harris for president. Five, get out, another round of shots. DNC, turn out for what?
That has been perpetually in my head on repeat since last night. I mean, that kind of energy Rick, are Republicans now looking back on their convention in Milwaukee thinking, dang?
Oh, I don't think we could have pulled that off. In conventions, you manage these things and you say, oh, this roll call is such a pain. You hate going through it. Nobody's interested. Nobody watches it. I cannot tell you how many phone calls and texts I've gotten today about why didn't we ever think of doing something fun like that in our roll call? It was a blast. Highlight of the convention as far as I'm concerned.
Wow, that's something. I mean, you had Kid Rock, right? I guess that would be the equivalent in Milwaukee.
But Lil Jon.
Lil Jon, though. So he actually rebuffed and asked for an endorsement by Donald Trump. You had to call him to come to Chicago.
You had to call him. He was on Celebrity Apprentice. And come on, that is the kind of thing that you can just imagine has frustrated Donald Trump.
Was that the end of this whole narrative that young black men are drifting toward Donald Trump? Is that now something in the past?
I don't think so. I don't think it's the end. I don't think you're going to do as well as he wanted. But I do think Republicans have a argument there when it comes to the economy, but they've just got to talk about it. But Donald Trump wants to talk about other things like Taylor Swift and AI. So, it's hard to keep him on track. But Lil Jon last night, that was a coup. And the DJ Wayne, is that it? He was amazing.
DJ Cassidy, you're referring to, yes. And I did have to look, Kailey.
Okay, well, there you go. As I think about finally what we're hearing from Donald Trump, he's going to be in North Carolina. He's there today with J.D. Vance, talking specifically, they say, about the issue of national security, though if we've learned our lesson from previous experiences, we may drift into other subject matter as well. But how should we think about his time spent in North Carolina now that we are seeing polling actually shifting in that swing state? Zabido's crystal ball moved it from lean czar to toss-up yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, we started this campaign saying there were going to be 7 key states that would decide this election, probably a dozen counties in each one. And we're right back to where we started. And by the way, same ones from 2020. I mean, this reset of this election is looking eerily like 2020 and in all states, not just North Carolina. But I would point out, too, this is the first major rally outdoors that Donald Trump's done since he got shot. And so, there's a little more mystique around this. And secondarily, he's been on message for a whole week now. I mean, he's really kind of taken the talking points that his campaign's given him to contrast nicely with the convention, even went out of his way to say nice things about Barack Obama last night or yesterday afternoon before the show. So there's something going on in the Trump campaign. And I think today is a very important turning point to see how his crowd is. And how he handles it. He'll be in a bulletproof box on that stage. And a performer like Donald Trump, that could really have a salutary effect on his ability to turn that crowd on.
That's a really good point, Kailey. We had seen reports earlier, and now we know for a fact the Secret Service has positioned ballistic glass around the country so they can have him protected on 3 sides, which does make the speech much more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I wonder how he will allude to the attempted assassination that we saw on the eve of the Republican convention as he counter-programs this Democratic one. We'll, of course, bring you anything noteworthy he says here on Bloomberg TV and radio and get analysis from our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino. Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.